Okay, so welcome back, everybody. And just before the webinar finished, Katie said that she had a very techie question. So I'll ask Katie to unmute herself and ask that question.
Hi, Russell and Caroline. Thank you very much for such an interesting talk and a great tool. You started off by saying 30% less NO2, 10% less particles, 44 degrees cooler, where trees are higher than 40%. I love that sort of statistic because it's so powerful when you're talking to people who know nothing about trees. But my brain immediately went to, is that because of the housing density and the fact that you couldn't get trees there? And then I thought, would any sort of green canopy matter? Could we be very innovative and start doing things like they do in Japan and having trees on the side of houses and stuff? But yeah, it was just, is it to do with the housing density rather than the trees? Because more houses might be more heat.
Not necessarily, no, because some of the research has been done in some quite high densely populated areas. And so it's about the canopy cover percentage, because you're basically having more canopy, so the trees are acting more as an air purifier.
So where you've got that higher canopy in a very dense area, it has
Yeah.
a set effect. Oh, I'd be really interested on a ref if you've got one.
Yeah, no, I was talking to Peter earlier. We probably should put some links out, because I know Peter's been talking with the BBC in his interview he did last Sunday about this as well. So I think it would be useful to pull together some links. I mean, I think sometimes it's very easy to get stuck on the trees on sides of buildings, but trees need space to grow. So if you grow trees on sides of buildings, they're probably never going to get massive. And actually, if we look across Wales or we look across anywhere in the UK, there is so much opportunity to plant that actually I think my advice, and I've been doing this for about 25 years, is to look for those easy wins. And it's not necessarily about numbers. It's about putting the right trees in, giving them space to grow, and more importantly, maintaining them. You know, we've seen far too many schemes that have come across with a revenue funding for a year and a capital funding for a year. Well, you know, if you're putting in a standard tree to try and stop it from becoming vandalized, it needs 3 years of watering. It needs 3 years worth of weeding. So I think actually we need to have a different conversation, and it needs to be less about numbers. Numbers can be useful. If you put lots of trees in hedgerows, that's a lot of numbers of trees. The trees are never going to get big, but if you need numbers for grants, then maybe that's the way forwards. But I think this is why canopy and using this as a metric is going to be much more important. But we also need to talk to funders about it, because funders are so used to the numbers game that funders of these projects and businesses need to be taught that, maybe numbers isn't the way forwards. So I think we need to change how we talk about trees to both politicians, businesses, NGOs, philanthropical groups. But I mean, I go to any city in the UK and there is so much space in grass verges, in parks, in schools, and you don't need to do a greener Grangetown. We will have to at some point to get to those, targets. But I think initially we should look to say, for the price of one tree in greener Grangetown, I could probably put, I don't know, 50 trees in grass verges. Let's do those 50 trees first.
Yeah, I loved your case study and the community engagement. I think it's really, really important, if we want people to understand the value of things, to bring them in right at the beginning to the planting and watering and looking after the tree and making them theirs.
Yeah, and we need to encourage more people into the sector as well, and that's the way we'll do it.
Yeah, we could learn a lot from that case study on how, if we want to make these points about the environment, we've got to make them with people and help them to do something active. So yeah, really, really great talk. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Would you be okay if I shared it with a colleague in England when you?
Yes.
Yeah, fab. Thank you.
I have put the slides into the chat that anyone can download. Feel free to share those. There's nothing sensitive on them. Share it as wide as you like. I've also put a link to our tree equity newsletter if you wanted to sign up to that. Just to add to that as well, one of the considerations into when we launched this tool was American Forests. Their CEO was going to COP28 in December, and we planned that launch alongside that, because that was raised within that setting as well at the time, and on a American level, but sharing that it within the UK and kind of looking at, actually, this isn't just this, you know, this is a worldwide issue, and we are taking this to our all parliamentary group, and we are trying to use this to have a lot of conversations at a bigger level, because we know that this is much more than schools, communities, local authorities, individuals. As Russell said, we want to try and change some of the narrative around trees and how we plant trees, and it's not necessarily about, you know, the funders going, well, in 2023 we funded 1.5 million trees. Actually, when we can give some of these other numbers, it helps to sell the story of maintaining those trees, because what's the point of planting 1.5 million trees if in 2 years 50,000 of them have survived? It's not about tree planting, it's about that tree establishment. And I think this is a really useful tool to sell that story, because if you plant those trees and they all die because there isn't the funding to maintain them, there's not the maintenance plan, there's not that community engagement that's made them care about trees, so that little Billy, who normally goes along to the park and pulls them all out, suddenly understands why those trees are important, and instead he takes his watering can when the next heat wave comes along and waters them. If we don't do that, then all we've done is waste money putting trees in the ground. So we're trying to change some of those conversations, so that we're kind of saying, actually, you want to say you've planted 1.5 million trees because of the benefits of trees, but the benefits come when that tree has reached maturity and it's established and it's independent, and that comes at a cost. So we're trying to steer some of those conversations and change that storytelling a little bit more.
And I think Welsh Government's behind, unfortunately. I'd like to be able to say Welsh Government was in front, but I'm afraid they're not. I mean, if we look to England and we look to their Urban Tree Challenge Fund, they were only offering this 1 year's worth of capital funding and 1 year's worth of revenue funding, and the sector fed back that, you know, you want us to put in bigger trees, we need more funding, and they've done that. They've changed that scheme now, so it's 3 years worth of funding for maintenance, for standards. But what's also interesting is they're doing a lot of checking that those trees are surviving, and that's probably the first scheme I've seen in the UK where officials are actually going and checking those trees are surviving. You know, if we looked at a lot of historic schemes, no one's been checking, and I think there is a problem there. There's no point in putting new funding in if those things are not being checked. Now that does make it more onerous, but actually I think with 3 years worth of maintenance, that's fine. You know, there are still some tweaks to improve that grant in terms of speed of payment to these groups. You know, East Marsh United, when you're waiting 4 or 5 months for money to come back in, that can be quite challenging for some of these groups because they don't have a large cash flow. So, you know, again, we're feeding back into English government about that, saying you need to look at, you know, how should you be doing part payments. But I think, again, if Welsh government wants to look to use this as a way of delivering funding, they should look to things like the Urban Tree Challenge Fund as a model to improve on for Wales.
Right. Well, I can't comment on the Welsh government, but those that know about forestry grants in the United Kingdom will know, there's a long history of development of those grants, and some quite well developed ways of paying those grants to account for maintenance and thinning. So there's probably lessons that we can learn there, and I very much hope that in the future we will overtake England once again. You know, we can learn from them and go one step further. But before I pontificate even further, Sorrel has got a question. Sorrel, would you mind turning your camera on and unmuting yourself and asking your question?
I was just wondering whether that, like Russell said, you know, most of those areas where there's a desperate need for trees, it's really, really expensive to put trees in. But is the next step maybe looking for the areas where the quick wins are and mapping those?
So I think,
actually, ironically, I know Katie's done work doing some of that kind of thing in Bridgend, but whether we can do more of that across Wales or in some of the bigger urban areas.
It's becoming easier to do. GIS is making those kind of things much easier and cheaper to do. But if you don't have local residents groups to work with in an area and there's no funding available, then I think it's coming at it from top down. I think tree equities is really useful because it's saying that these are the areas you should prioritise, which makes it easy to deal with the politicians. Because the ones that are shouting, "I want trees in my ward," I can say, "Sorry, you're at 90. You know, I need to be working in the 56s, I'm afraid." And you know, if I can get my local authority to come on board that that's where I'm going to spend the limited budgets I've got, then that helps to start off with. But I think the problem with a lot, if you without the funding, without the staff to deliver, and without groups to work with, you could spend a lot of money on mapping that then doesn't do anything, and we have seen that in the past. So I think you need to, you could use GIS once you've got funding, staff available, and money to go and plant. You could then use mapping quite quickly to be more smarter, you know, especially when we start to see utility plans being, you know, more widely available, because you can then overlay those on those to try and work out. But I'm a little bit hesitant to say, yes, let's go and map all these open areas, because potentially if there's no funding for 10 years, they'll become fully utilities by the time we get there, and it's a complete waste of money. So I'm more about, you need to build links with those community groups. You need people that want to work with you, and you can build on that. So, you know, the work we did at Grimsby, we've trained up East Marsh now. I don't need to go back there next year to plant in schools, because they can do it. And actually, so that's much more important to me in terms of, you know, upskilling to make sure that there's a longevity to these kind of plantings.
Thanks, Russell. Jerry Langford's got a question. He's asked, could we say a bit more about the role of the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare?
Yes. So yeah, sorry, when I was talking about those people who input, I should have been a little bit clearer. So the tool itself, there were 3 main organisations that partnered together to develop the tool. So there was ourselves at the Woodland Trust, American Forest, and the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. So American Forest role was very software based. They developed the tool, they analysed the data, they developed that tool because they had that starting point already. But one of the things that we had to do was we can't just take the tool from the US and put it in the UK and expect it to tell that story in the same way, because there are similarities, but we aren't the same place. We are different people. You know, that I talked about that ethnic minority difference. That's huge in the US because of that history of redlining and things like that. And there is still that same story here, and we want to delve into that more, but it's not the same. It's different. So some of their priority indicators are slightly different, and that's where part of where Centre for Sustainable Healthcare came in, looking at that people side of things. American Forest are really good at the data side of things. We had that tree side of things, and Centre for Sustainable Healthcare helped with the people side of things. Everyone inputted into all of the bits, but they were that people side of things, looking at actually what are our priority indicators. So there was discussion over whether we did include the number of ethnic minorities in an area. That is a priority indicator in the US, but we decided it was a factor, so it's in our filters, but it's not one of our priority indicators, because actually, for example, when you look at some areas of Belfast where immigration was really high in the 60s, nobody wanted to move to Belfast because it was a war zone, pretty much. So, but they still have some areas of really low tree equity that are in areas without much ethnic diversity at all. So we know it's impact, but it's not the only story. It's not the only factor. But so yeah, so Centre for Sustainable Healthcare were one of our partners. They didn't just kind of input enough advice, that they did partner into it. They helped to fund some of the tool, and they were part of the core stakeholder group and really input some of their knowledge and tools into that. And they are really taking this forward into things like NHS forests, and how do we make this a problem that is not just for people in forestry, in ARB roles, in local authorities. Actually, we need to make this everybody's problem. It's community groups, it's schools, it's hospitals, it's businesses, it's everybody has to be part of the solution, because trees are for everybody. And so yeah, so that's a bit of a summary. Hopefully that answers that question about what their role within the tool was.
And it'll be interesting to see where urban forestry lands at the moment. You know, it's kind of stuck in the farming and rural parts of governments generally. But actually, if you look at tree equity and you look at the factors that we're measuring, should it be better in health? You know, it's the poor partner, if I'm honest, against farming, because that's where the majority of money goes across all of the you know, devolved authorities, England, Scotland, etc. But you know, if you look at the scoring that tree equity is talking about, a lot of these are health priorities. And so actually, you know, if we can see more investment in urban forestry, we'll have less bad outcomes, which are going to be more expensive on NHS going forward. So there is an argument to say, you know, is urban forestry in the right part of government? Should it be part of health? Sorry, Pete, I know you probably can't speak, but I can. So
yeah, and that's very much some of the kind of conversations that we want to be having, and some of the conversations we're having with local authorities and tree officers who have very, very limited budgets. But actually, this is where this tool can come in really helpful, because when it comes to looking at, well, if you've got an area where you need to plant trees and your health data is low, well, then you need to get your health department contributing to the budget of planting those trees, because you're solving some of their problems. And it might be a bold statement, but I'm going to say it anyway. I do think that really, if you've got a problem, trees are the answer. You know, so we can solve our health problems with trees, not necessarily fully, but it's going to contribute to them. We can solve some of our traffic problems, our pollution. Trees are not just environmental answers. It's not just about climate change, which is some of what we're trying to show with tree equity. I don't know about the rest of you, but when I joined the Woodland Trust and people go, oh, so what do you do now? You talk about trees. People go, oh, trees. I've got these trees outside and the sap and the leaves. And people are so quick to see the problems with trees, and they don't realize just how much trees do for us and how much impact they have. And this is an opportunity to start some of those conversations. And we have been having those conversations with people who haven't engaged in environmental issues and conservation and things like that in the past, because it's put that in a realm that they understand. Oh, I've got asthma and my tree equity score is low, and oh, apparently that can help with this. I'm going to speak to my MP because this, and it just opens up those conversations and those doors.
I think also in areas where it is much more highly and densely urbanized, what we're now starting to see is the bigger developers that work in these areas, they've got social outcomes that they need. They've got, you know, alongside CSR targets, they've got now social outcomes. There's entire social outcome teams in some of these bigger developers. And actually, trees were kind of a nice, fluffy add-on to planning applications. Whereas now this is allowing, you know, local authorities, planning departments, and others to talk to these bigger organizations and say, well, actually, no, trees aren't just this nice, fluffy outcome on a plan that you might plant at the end if you've got any money left. This is how you're going to meet these social outcomes. And so there's some really good work going on at the moment in Birmingham with the Birmingham Tree People. So it's part of an urban forestry accelerator looking at how to improve things, and bigger developers there are really interested in areas of deprivation where they're going in and maybe, you know, raising old flats to the ground and rebuilding, is to how trees can help them with these social outcomes. And I think that's quite a change. Again, you know, the Birmingham example is quite good. It's not about millions of trees. Actually, in some cases it's about 30 or 40 trees in a ward, really well targeted, but they're starting to find bigger developers that have never spoken to them are really interested because it ticks other boxes for them. So yeah, again, it's about language and how we talk to people, I think.
So I'm going to raise my hand and ask, in the absence of Google data, obviously in Wales, we're one of the world leaders in mapping our urban trees.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's any way that even in the interim, you can use our urban tree canopy cover data set to enable more areas of Wales to benefit from the tree equity tool until Google has finished its mapping of tree cover.
It's definitely worth looking at. And I think also, so we work with quite a lot of councils anyway in more rural areas through the work we do with Tree Plotter. And so I think any data sets that can be made publicly available that people can use, we can drop in. So yeah, the sort of tree equity stuff is about you putting all this data in and coming out with the formulae. So I think the more and more of that data that's freely available for people can use, but in the interim, there's no reason why you can't just add it in as GIS layers anyway and start to map some of these things. So I've put a couple of links into some applications that have kind of done that, because it does allow you to then look across your entire geographical spread, especially if you're more rural. to sort of make sure you're not missing areas with high health issues, or but I think what's also needed from government is looking at where data sets are poor. Heat Island has been historically one where the data sets have been poor. It's great to now starting to see some work coming through, but I think again the role of government could be really useful in terms of looking at where those data sets are missing. That could be really useful.
Thank you so much. We're almost out of time now. I'm going to close the webinar for sure at 11 o'clock, but just to say that I'll be sending an email after this with the links to the recording of this webinar and this discussion. I will also include links to some of the research that I mentioned in my BBC Wales interview on Sunday, and links to the tree equity tool again, just in case you haven't already leapt in and copied them from the chat here. So I think it remains for me now to say a huge sincere thanks to Caroline and to Russell for giving us a fascinating webinar and showing us a tool which its simplicity and clarity, I think, is going to make it really, really helpful in many, many ways in the future. So thank you very much indeed, Caroline and Russell. And thanks to everybody who came along. And I hope to see you at the next webinar.